Hi, this is Debbie, and today I have a video tutorial for waffle flower crafts, which I'm also going to share here on my YouTube channel and blog. And today we're going to be looking at using gouache and watercolour to paint on dark cardstock. I'm going to be using the Wild and Free stamp set along with some gouache and some watercolours. But before we get into stamping, let's take a quick look at what watercolours and gouache do on dark cardstock. I must admit this is the first time I've used gouache, apart from some white gouache to create splatters on my projects. So today we're going to experiment together. I'm starting with some dark cardstock and my usual watercolour palette. Now watercolours are transparent, so when you apply them to dark cardstock you generally don't see the true colour. So I'm working with some Daniel Smith Quinacridone Coral, and once I've got some paint on the brush and I add it to the dark cardstock, you can see that you're not really getting the true colour of the paint showing through. The dark cardstock is muting the colour down, and that's because of the transparent nature of watercolours. Even if I really load my brush with paint, you're not seeing that beautiful colour coming through. One solution is to add a white base to the dark card. So I've got a flower from the Wild and Free stamp set, and I'm stamping that in white pigment ink, and then once that is dry it will create a base to add the colour to. I'm using the same Daniel Smith Quinacridone Coral, and having that white pigment ink base means that the colour is starting to show through now. You're starting to see more of that pink colour rather than the dark cardstock which is behind. Let's move on to talking about gouache. Gouache is an opaque paint, and therefore it will cover up the cardstock colour that it has been painted onto, and you'll be able to see the true colours of the paint that you're using. I'm using some permanent white gouache from Winsor & Newton, and you can see that by painting even a light layer onto the dark cardstock that it comes across as being a true white, that you are not getting a muted grey that you would do if you'd been using a watercolour on this card. I've stamped the flower again with white pigment ink, and this time I'm going to add some of the Daniel Smith Quinacridone Coral to the Winsor & Newton gouache, and we're going to mix that together to get a nice pink colour and then apply that onto the pigment base. And hopefully now the combination of the white pigment base of the ink combined with the gouache mixed in with the watercolour, we're going to get a nice opaque look of the colour on the dark cardstock. And indeed I think that's looking really good now. You're getting the lovely pink popping off the dark cardstock. Gouache gives quite a flat look to your painting, which is often used by illustrators. For example, if you look at a children's book illustration, you'll see that flat look to their painting. And I want to experiment more with this, but I don't want to go out and buy a whole new pack of paints. So combining one tube of gouache, the Winsor & Newton Permanent White, with my normal palette of watercolours means that I'm getting the best of both worlds. Okay, let's get on with some stamping now. I'm using the Wild and Free stamp set, and there's that lovely large image in the middle there of the sentiment along with the deer and the flowers. However, I want to separate the wording from the rest of the image so that I can stamp and emboss my own design of background images and then come in with the white pigment ink and some of the gouache and watercolour to create a design which combines the two elements. I'm simply taking my scissors and carefully cutting around the wording, and this won't damage the stamp in the sense of it will still stamp perfectly. All the individual elements will still stamp perfectly when they're separated from one another, and you can easily match them back up together to stamp them as one if you want to. To help with my design, I'm stamping some of the flowers and leaves that I'm intending using on a post-it note. I'm using white pigment ink. It doesn't matter what ink you use, I just had that out already. And I'm going to trim those out, and then I can use those when I'm planning my design to leave space for those flowers and leaves. And so you can see here I've got the Wild and Free sentiment on the dark cardstock. This is some slate card from Sam Says Stamp, and I'm using the post-its to make sure I leave space for those images while I'm stamping the other elements. I'm using the MISTI, and once I've decided where I want the first few elements to be, I can then close the door of the MISTI to pick up those stamps. I'm then going to take away the post-its, and this leaves me with the card so that I can prepare it for heat embossing. I'm using some EK Success powder tool, and this will help prevent any embossing powder sticking where I don't want it to. I've got some Versamark ink, and I'm going to ink those images and then stamp them a couple of times with the MISTI stamping tool to get a really good impression. I can then sprinkle it in some white heat embossing powder and heat set the embossing powder with a hot heat tool. It helps if you make sure your heat tool is really good and hot before bringing it to the embossing powder, and this will mean that your card will warp less. I'm going to repeat the stamping and heat embossing with some of the other elements that I want in the design, until the design's complete. What I'm aiming for is a base of white heat embossing to give some really nice bright white popping off the dark cardstock. And then I'm going to go in and stamp the flowers and leaves as part of the design with the white pigment ink, and then add the gouache and watercolour mixes on top. Now that I've got a base of white heat embossed images, I'm now going to add the elements that I'd been reserving space for, those leaves and flowers that I'd used the post-it notes for. I'm now going to stamp those in the white pigment ink and then dry those off before painting them in the gouache and watercolour mix. I've got a couple of tips for you. The first is that I've got a piece of old acetate that I use to help protect my card from images which have already got ink on them. So a lot of these images now have white pigment ink on them, and I don't want to get that onto my cardstock. So I'm using the acetate to protect the card while I design where I want everything, and then I can remove the acetate to stamp them. This will give me the white pigment ink base for these flowers and leaves that I can then go on to paint. Now, my second tip is that while I'm doing this, as I have been from the beginning, I've been stamping multiple copies of this card, and that means that if I mess up, I've got some reserves already in place. Once you've got your images onto the drawer of the MISTI, it is so simple just to chop up a few more pieces of card and then stamp those at the same time as you're stamping the others. You can just keep swapping your card in and out until you've got multiples of the same design, and then if you do make a mistake, you can always throw one away and you've got another couple to rely on. Having dried off the pigment ink, I'm now going to move on to choosing the colours I want to use for this card. I'm going to mix each of these watercolours along with the Winsor & Newton gouache. Now I'm going to continue using the Daniel Smith quinacridone coral that I used in the experimenting at the beginning. I'm also going to use some Winsor & Newton Windsor Orange Red shade, some Daler-Rowney Phthalo Turquoise, and some Winsor & Newton Permanent Sap Green mixed with some Prussian Blue to give a slightly more blue tone to the green. I'm now moving on to painting the flowers with the watercolour and gouache mixes, and I'm using a Winsor & Newton No. 3 pointed round brush. This has a fine tip which enables me to get into the smaller areas of the flowers and paint over the pigment ink. With a fine tip brush such as this, I find it easiest not to push the brush away from you. I find that then the bristles tend to split and you get a jaggedy edge. So I try as best I can to pull the brush towards me, and that seems to keep the tip of the brush intact and you get the really nice smooth lines. In order to keep the brush moving as smoothly as possible, it's also a good idea to move your cardstock rather than try and move your hand or the paintbrush. So keep rotating the cardstock to get the best angle to do the painting. When I mix these colours together, I didn't add a lot of water and I'm getting a really good opaque coverage. If you find that perhaps you added too much water and your mix is a bit liquidy, then the advantage of gouache is that you can always paint over the top of it to make sure you do get that good coverage. I'm finishing off the piece by painting the berries blue, and then I was looking at that leaf in the top right there and thinking it looked a little bit bare. So I took some of the permanent white gouache and painted some veins over the top. And then also I thought I could add some swooshes around the flowers to add a little detail to those as well. Finally, I filled in some gaps around the design with some dots of the white gouache. Once the panels were dry, I cut them down and then I'm going to mount them on some marshmallow card bases. I've cut those to be 4 bar, which is roughly 3.5 by 5 inches. And I've also cut some mats for the painted panels from some surf blue card. I thought that helped the panels to pop nicely off the white card bases. I added the blue mats to the panels with glue runner and then added foam adhesive to the back of the blue to mount onto the white card base. And that's this set of cards complete, looking at how you can use one tube of gouache to extend the use of your watercolours to be able to paint on dark cardstock. I'll leave links to the products that I've used in the YouTube description below, along with a coordinating blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.